So, as stated in the previous videos, once the Philippines becomes a formal colony of the United States, that means that the Philippines could become a source of cheap labor, specifically when there's labor shortages in the United States at any given time. And this occurs actually during the 1920s. But let's remember the first significant migratory flow of Filipinos as cheap labor occurred earlier than 1924. It occurred with this labor migration to Hawaii, as we discussed last time. During this time, around 73,000 Filipinos migrated to Hawaii. And still today, if you go to Hawaii, you'll notice a strong influence not only of Japanese culture, but even Filipino culture there. But again, the first significant numbers of Filipino wards, which are actually colonial subjects, as we acknowledge, that arrived to the U.S. would happen during this period. We called it the second wave with the previous slide. Agribusiness laborers working as cheap labor. And what were the conditions that led to this immigration flow? Well, first we need to see how the 1924 Immigration Act figured into this. And as stated on the slide here, the two senators who sponsored this law were Senators Johnson and Senators Reed, hence the name of this bill. It's known as the Johnson-Reed Act. So this act was passed during the height of Anglo-nativism in the 1920s. And at this point, there were so many immigrants, millions of immigrants coming every year to the United States from different parts of Europe, mostly Southern and Eastern Europe. So you had Italians coming in, Greeks, Jewish, Russians, Hungarians, and others coming in. Why are they coming, by the way? They're coming in because this is the phase of our Industrial Revolution where we had severe labor shortages. We lacked industrial workers, factory workers, and therefore we sought that labor abroad in Europe, specifically, again, the southern and eastern parts of Europe. Now, these new immigrants that had been coming over, and by the way, within those decades from, let's say, 1870s through the early 1920s, about 12 million immigrants came from Europe during this part of our immigration history. Many of them, however, were not that traditional Americans that Anglos were used to. For example, they were Catholic, not Protestant, or Greek Orthodox, perhaps even Jewish. They were darker skinned. Think of Italians, for example. So again, many Anglos in the United States were wringing their hands, anxious about the fact that the country was being taken over by different types of Europeans, and they felt the need to act. So that indeed happened during the 1920s. Obviously, this law passes in the mid-20s here. Okay, so as stated in the slide, the attempt of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act was to drastically cut immigration, to curb that immigration flow from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they did this primarily through something called the National Origins Act, as stated here. What does this refer to? Well, think of the term national origins, and then think about the different immigrants coming in terms of race. And by the way, I mentioned darker-skinned Europeans, like Italians. Let's remember that back then, race being a social construction, in the 1800s, some felt Italians were not quote-unquote white. I know we think of Italian Americans today as whites, but back then it was a contentious issue. So, again, Anglos are concerned about this. So what they wanted to do is look at every nation that had a historical past with immigration to the United States. They listed each nation, and what they did is think about the people there and the skin color. They thought about race. And therefore, they said, well, the darker the skin, the less we are going to allow per year, per annum. Okay. So you can imagine A through Z, right? This tabulation of country connected to skin color, to race. For example, Italy would have a smaller number allowed in, a smaller quota allowed for immigration per year. Country like France, country like Sweden, very high number allowed per year, high quota. So obviously, this is a race-based law. And still today, when you look at our history of race relations and so forth, this has a terrible reputation because, it's illustrative of our racial ideas about who should be in the country. So again, hopefully you could see how the National Origins Act is going to be effective in curtailing that immigration flow from Europe, and also that is based on skin color, right? And the outcome, the preferred outcome, was the maintaining of America's racial homogeneity as being predominantly Anglo, or Northern European, perhaps Western European, certainly not Southern Europeans. Okay, and indeed it was successful. The National Origins Act would not be repealed, by the way, until the age of civil rights in 1965. Now, what about Asians and the 1924 Immigration Act? Well, what was added as a provision here was the Asiatic Exclusion Act, and basically this barred immigration from all of Asia. We already know that there's the 1882 Chinese Exclusion, and certainly the Gentlemen's Agreement Act. But now you're talking about the entirety of the Asian continent. So there we go. This is a very effective law, very race-based, racist, to be frank. And you can imagine the reaction to this for those industrialists, right? Economically, this means that their source of cheap labor is going to be affected. Again, this highlights the tension between the political needs at this time, which was to, again, maintain that racial homogeneity. And that's at odds with the economic dimension, which was to maintain the supply of cheap labor from abroad. And the two conflict. And it just so happens, since this is the 1920s, the height of nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, well, the political side will win over the economic side. So this leads to drastic labor shortage. And in the West, we know there's different industries in the West. They're going to need their labor, their cheap labor to be more specific. And there's one area that is actually exempt from the Asiatic Exclusion Act. And that's the Philippines. Why the Philippines? Well, it should be obvious. The Philippines is unincorporated territory. It's not a foreign country. Filipinos are wards or U.S. nationals. They could freely migrate to the United States, as we acknowledged earlier. Therefore, that's the new source of labor, especially for Western agribusiness after 1924. So again, you see the first significant flow of Filipinos coming to the mother country, to use that term, or the metropole, and they're going to specifically find themselves on the U.S. West Coast, and they're there to replenish that labor shortage. And they are allowed in, the condition of possibility for this to actually materialize is the fact that legally they are colonial subjects, or let's use the official term, wards or U.S. nationals, right? But they are allowed to freely migrate to the United States. And hence, this will indeed be the new source of labor for agribusiness in the West. So now we could talk about a definite migratory flow of Filipinos, wards, U.S. nationals, to the mother country. And here are some illustrations. Okay, here right now shows the really backbreaking work of agricultural workers. I mean, still today, this is the nature of labor that they do. It's called stoop labor because you have to stoop like these guys, right? And do that in the hot sun amid those conditions all day. So, needless to say, many Americans, especially because of the low pay, would rather not do that type of work, whether we're talking about back then in the 20s or even now. And here are some other pictures of these Filipino laborers on their day off, presumably, and actually dressed kind of nice, right? So these are the agribusiness workers that arrived. They're recruited by American Agribusiness. And let me remind you, agribusiness means the commercialization of agriculture, right? And in general, just the food we eat, right, is agribusiness. Agriculture as big business. So they're recruited into this particular economic niche, and they find themselves again in the American West, as well as some would end up in the Alaskan fish canneries, by the way, but most of them would become agricultural workers. Now, here's a name that describes these Filipino farm workers, Manong. They're known as the Manongs or the Manong generation. Where does this name come from? Well, first of all, it's a Tagalog term from the Tagalog language. If you don't know what Tagalog is, it's a dialect in the Philippines, which is the main dialect today. It's the official dialect because the Philippines is comprised of countless numbers of dialects there, but it's the main one. So in the Tagalog dialect, Manong means an older man, right? And it's given as a sign of respect, Manong. Okay, so however, these guys aren't older. They're young. In fact, demographically, as we'll discuss soon, they're in their late teens, 20s, maybe early 30s. So they're all very young, many of them unattached, single, unmarried males. Why are they called Manongs, which usually signifies older men, out of a sign of respect again? Well, here's the deal. They came over in the 20s and 30s, and they were largely forgotten in the history books until the formation of ethnic studies as an valid and legitimate academic discipline. And this occurred during the age of civil rights again in 1968. So once this academic enterprise got underway, well, they knew one of their tasks is to research different ethnic groups in the United States. So you had Asian Americans, scholars working in studying these ethnic histories. And some of them remembered, hey, there's these Filipinos that are mostly male, retired. They live in San Francisco or various places. And they talk about them being agricultural workers. We should go interview them. And this is what the scholars are thinking about, right, during the 70s, during the 80s. So they actually conduct these interviews with the now, retired, many of them in their twilight years, perhaps 70 years old. And they go interview them about their experiences as an agricultural worker working for agribusiness, doing this, what we call stoop labor, right? And because they're older by then and the scholars were young, well, they addressed them as Manong as a sign of respect. And that name stuck, the Manong generation. So still today, when you read books in Filipino American history or just Asian American history in general, you'll see the term Manong that applies to these early agricultural workers.